All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first event in the Chicago Poetry Center's 50th anniversary learning series. I'm Helene Achanzar, Director of Programs at the Chicago Poetry Center. At CPC, our mission is to connect people in poetry, equitably engage poets with communities, and advance creative literacy in the city and beyond. We do this through poetry programming in Chicago area schools and through public events like a monthly reading series. This year, CPC turned 50 years old, and to celebrate, we're offering 3 virtual presentations that gather Chicago poets to talk about the next steps in poetry. Tonight, we'll hear from Lisa Lowe about how to submit poems to literary journals. In the coming months, we'll hear from 2 other Chicago-based poets on how to apply for writing residencies and how to organize a poetry manuscript. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce tonight's presenter. Lisa Lowe is the author of Crown for the Girl Inside, winner of the Vinyl 45 chapbook contest from Yes Yes Books. She is the recipient of a 2023 Pushcart Prize and the 2020 Gulf Coast Nonfiction Prize. Her work has appeared in Copper Nickel, Ecotone, the Massachusetts Review, Poetry, the Southern Review, and elsewhere. She served as associate editor at the Cincinnati Review and is currently assistant poetry editor at Acre Books. All right, Lisa, take it away.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here with you all tonight. Helene, thank you so much for planning this and inviting me here in Chicago Poetry Center for putting on this amazing event. I'm really excited about the 2 other panels. I was telling Helene earlier, I'm especially excited to learn about how to apply to residencies since I would like to go to one myself. And yeah, I know it's been a really difficult for a week for everybody here. Just again, thank you for tuning in. And I hope that you're able to process with your loved ones and yeah, just um, uh, be with your communities during this time. I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. Okay. View. Okay, play from the start. Okay, showing up for everybody? All right. I realize that I can't see the chat, so maybe I can try to put it in the corner right here as I'm talking. All right, so I thought I'd go ahead and start a little bit about me. I was really excited when Helene asked me to do this panel a couple of years ago when I was working at the Cincinnati Review. I wrote a blog post on making a better submission spreadsheet. So I've been really excited about submitting for a long time, just like something that it was like been a journey, different ways of thinking about submitting from when I first started, and just like the ebbs and flows of being on this journey. So yeah, excited to talk about it. So okay, a little bit about me. So here's some publications that I've read or edited at Indiana Review, Cincinnati Review, and Acre Books. Acre Books has been really interesting because it's a book publisher. So in that sense, I've been able to read poetry in terms of longer poetry manuscripts. We also read poetry samples instead of reading the whole book right away. That's been really great to be able to look at poetry in that way. But other than that, I've gotten to read at these 2 other publications and Cincinnati Review also specifically editing, looking at cross-genre work as well. I helped judge some poetry contests at the Cincinnati Review also, being a final round reader and pushing it on to the genre editor who chose the winning pieces. Poetry Magazine was really interesting because there were about, I think, 5 or 6 of us. who looked to that year's issues, and we were able to come together and have a conversation about what do we think constitutes like a really strong piece that would be an award winner. And Lucky Jefferson is a really wonderful um, literary nonprofit that has a magazine. And this just happened. So the poetry and prose winners are going to be announced soon. So you should all follow them on social media. Um, so as I was putting together the slideshow, I realized that I started submitting in 2014. So it's my not 20 years, 10-year anniversary. And I got to take a look at all of my past submissions. I counted up about 430 submissions, and there were more nice rejections than I thought that there would be. So that was nice to see. It definitely didn't feel that way as I was experiencing them, and for a total of about 30 acceptances. Here is a picture of me doing work in a bad way. So hopefully you all, when you're doing your work, you're not having as bad a posture as me. Um, but yeah, just it's been quite the ride so far. Um, I thought I'd begin with a little bit about why do we not submit in the first place? What are some obstacles to submitting? One that's obvious is the submission fees, right? The cost and accessibility of submissions. I know that when I was first submitting work, um, I was like, oh, I'm just gonna go for the fee-free submissions. But then I decided as I was going along in my career that I was like, oh, I think this is something that I want to invest in. But thinking about 430 submissions times $2 or $3 is a lot of money. Not to mention all of the other contest fees that are included in that that I've also submitted to. Another thing that I've thought of is how to know if your poems are even ready. Do I want to send them out? Are they ready to get sent out? This bullet point I'm not really going to talk about as much, but there's this wonderful blog post by my friend Maddie Wattenberg, Is Your Poem Ready for Submitting? And at the end of the slideshow, I'll have a resource link to a document where you can find a bunch of sources that I've referenced here. So this is going to be on there for later. I think something from this blog post that really stuck out to me, she kind of posed a question like, instead of thinking if the poem is ready to submit, think more about what is the poem doing right now? And if it's something interesting, if you feel good about what it's trying to do, then maybe it is a good time for other people to have some eyes on it. So I thought that was a really great way to reframe that question, if your poem is ready to submit. Finding places to submit to. There's so many places to submit to. So yeah, definitely one that can be a barrier to submitting. Also, submitting takes a lot of time and energy. There are a bunch of kind of small rules that are sort of in place in terms of etiquette, in terms of individual journals, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Um, Also the emotional experience of receiving rejections. I think that's a huge thing about rejections and submitting in general. I was just thinking that like um, there are other fields that also have a lot of rejections or a lot of experience of receiving critique and feedback. I can think of like acting, for example, like doing auditions and things like that. But also just envying other professions that don't have that constant kind of receiving feedback as well. It's not easy. And then lastly, the busyness of life. So here's my baby when he was, can't remember exactly how old, but his first year of life. He prevented me from remembering many deadlines that I had missed. And I also wanted to ask you all, can you all think of any other barriers to submitting that I haven't listed up here? Thank you. Pretty cute. Okay. If not, then yeah, feel free to add anything else. Oh, access to resources like this. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, some people don't even know like where can we find conversations on how to submit in the first place. Weird platforms, different places where submissions are required. Yeah, a lot of them require submittable, but there's some places that don't, and it's a weirder platform to get into. Not knowing where to submit, we'll talk about that as well. Yeah, that's great. Trusting others with your work. Um, it's hard to put it out there, especially you don't know who is going to be reading your work. Hmm. The journal fits you or not. Cover letters. Okay, yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. Oh, that's a good one. Copyright and ownership. Yeah, maybe we can touch on that in the Q&A a little bit. That's a good one to refer to. All right, so hopefully we can talk about most, if not all of these tonight. I'm gonna go ahead and start with where to submit. Okay, I'm gonna start off with the second bullet point. So there are great places to look for where to submit to. Here we have Clifford Garsing who puts out this yearly ranked list, and I put a screenshot up here of a list of the 2024 poetry journals. I think he uses a methodology that incorporates like looking at if the journal has publications or has pieces in Pushcart, the Pushcart Prize. He has a special formula that ranks them like this. But I would say, there are many lists like this one that Garstang uses, but I would say to take them with a grain of salt. I like to use them as a reference point to see what do some people think are the more prestigious journals than others. But yeah, again, take it with a grain of salt. Poets and Writers is a great database that I like to use. I generally use it a little bit more for contests because they have a great place where you can um, filter by genre and by submission window, whether it's open or not in that current moment that you're looking for it. I think that one's really great. Duotrope is kind of a special website that I haven't used in a long time. Um, but I did use it quite a bit at the very beginning. It contains lists like whether there are the journal is like really fast at replying back to you or takes longer or not. And I think at the time, I'm not sure if anyone else has been using it more recently, but at the time they were also places where you can input what submissions that you were currently sending out to kind of have a place to organize them, kind of like a spreadsheet. Okay, great. Some people are popping in some places on the chat. Okay, awesome. Yeah, yeah. Erica Cross, great. Um, I think one great place to find where to submit is looking at the publications of writers that you already love and admire. And to think of this both in terms of established writers that you really love, where are they publishing, but also emerging writers. I think emerging writers specifically have more of an eye on what are some up and coming journals, especially digital only journals. I think especially with established writers, they may be at that time of their life, there's less urgency to publish. They may be receiving solicitations from fancy journals to publish in them, which is great. Again, a great way to look for journals, but especially the emerging writers, I think they really know where some exciting journals are at. So that's a great place to look for where to submit. There's a whole conversation about whether online is better or print is better. And I think that stereotype of print being a little bit more prestigious still exists a little bit. Um, I think online more and more is becoming a place where people want to submit instead because of the shareability of your work. I know a friend who's a fiction writer, so it's a little bit different for us, I think. But she had published a story in the Offing, a digital-only journal, and an agent. She wasn't agented, but an agent reached out to her and was like, "Hey, I'd love to read your book when you have a book ready." And then this agent, potential agent, emailed her every year to just check in. So I know I myself have never received such an email as a poet, but I think it's just a testament to see what you're able to um, what having that platform online is able to do. And then tiering your submissions, thinking about sort of similar to college admissions, where you have like your reach schools or your safety schools. If there are some, dream journals that you want to get into, you want to put them in one tier and submit to them at the same time. So I think a little bit differently from college admissions, where you would like spread your submissions widely across the different tiers. The strategy that you would submit to maybe one tier at a time, like all of my dream journals at one time, and then step down. Hey, I didn't get into any of those, and then see what your next tier would look like. But there are really just different experiences with what quote unquote prestigious journals look like, right? I've gotten some opportunities from journals that are maybe less traditionally prestigious, and vice versa. Like some journals that are print only, that I think my poems have never seen the light of day. No one's ever read that poem. So I think having a mix of them is kind of a great way to think about it as well. Okay. Cover letters. Oh, I did want to say one more thing about where to submit. I think somebody mentioned about thinking about the fit of the journal. And often the journal will say, like, hey, take a look at our journal, read us first to make sure that we are something that you already are interested in, the work that kind of matches. And I think that's great too. But to keep in mind that everybody reads a little bit differently. The editors, the readers, they read widely as well. So keeping that in mind. But if you like the overall vibe of the journal, some journals are a little bit more explicit in their mission. Or thinking about equity inclusion, for example, those are interesting things to look for. I think also journals that are supporting their writers in other ways, are their blog posts or their interviews with their writers, not necessarily ones who are having books out, which is already great, but are they also engaging with writers who may not have books out as well? I think that's a really great sign to look for. Okay, so cover letters. The basic thing about cover letters is I like to keep mine really simple. Um, so basic things, expressing gratitude. Most journals allow simultaneous submissions, so making sure to list if your work is being simultaneously submitted, since I usually pretty much always do that, including a bio. And sometimes the journal will tell you to mention the names of the poem, or the poems that you have submitted, either in kind of like a space and submittable, like yeah. Um, Text box in submittable or in the cover letter itself. Usually it's optional. Sometimes they ask you to refer to a specific editor. So I guess following the rules is always good in that end. But I don't think that anyone is going to dock you if you do not include those things. The work is really the most important. Okay, and I wanted to show you a sample cover letter that I always use. Okay, really simple. Dear editors, no journal name, really short, and then I copy and paste my third person bio. I think you can use a first person bio as well, but since I use a third person bio for everything else, including if my work is being accepted, I just have that. And yeah, I think this way, I think at the very beginning of submitting, I used to include all of my poem titles, even if they didn't ask for it. But then I was just like, well, this energy isn't needed here. I can put that energy elsewhere. So I like to think of it that way. Okay, formatting your submission. So standard requirements, usually poetry packets are measured by page length or the number of poems. And they often, or sometimes they'll ask you to use a standard font like Times New Roman or Garamond or something like that. I think, yeah, it's just really interesting because I think that a lot of poets are like, oh, Garamond is the font of the poets, while fiction writers are like, oh, I must only write in Times New Roman. Um, and I think there was a period of time where I was like, I'm only writing in Times New Roman and submitting into them. But as an experiment, later on, I thought maybe I should submit in Garamond and see if that changed anything. But obviously, I couldn't tell whether that would change anything or not. But it's just interesting to think about how font kind of might affect your own perception of work. Um, there are also specialized requirements that some journals might have, so just keeping an eye on that as you're looking through formatting requirements, including page numbers, the actual name of the document, like they might have you write Lisa underscore low dot docx or something like that, including your contact info or a cover letter. I find that usually, places that don't use Submittable might be the ones who ask you to include a cover letter or contact info in the actual document itself. And then also document types. So yeah, I often try to do PDFs just because the lines won't shift in a weird way depending on the recipient's screen formatting. But there are some journals that make sure that or want you to only submit in Doc or DocX. So keeping that in mind as well. Some questions that I thought of as I was putting this particular slide together, I've included in these cloud bubbles right here. So the idea of ordering within the poem, within the packet, and um, also if the poems in the packet need to be related. I would say that probably the first poem does get a little bit more airtime than the others, just because that's the first thing that the editor or reader sees of your work. I've heard people say that first and last poems are the most impactful in a packet. Maybe that's the case for some readers. I would say that, if you're a good reader, a good editor, you'll probably look at everything at least a little, at least briefly. You'll look at all of the poems. Um, and in terms of if the poems in the packet need to be related, I think it can make for a pleasant experience to see if the poems are kind of building upon each other, but I wouldn't say that that would be, a requirement. I think if the poem is strong, it's strong and it'll stand out no matter what. So it's not a reason to not put together a packet of unrelated poems. Okay. All right, here's some other rules besides formatting things that you can also run into. So simultaneous submissions that we have talked about a little bit briefly in terms of cover letters. Um, I think there are some people who will go ahead and submit simultaneously, even if a journal doesn't want that. I haven't tried that. But I think more and more, even the journals that used to be strictly non-simultaneous, like the Sun magazine, I think it's becoming more and more popular to do simultaneous submissions. So just keeping that in mind. Withdrawing your submissions, usually there's a place in Submittable to add a note to your submission. But other than that, if they use the other submission manager, it's often they'll ask you to write an email to the specific, like a specific email address, maybe a managing editor or just a general email address for their journal. Not submitting more than maybe one, two, probably not three times, several times per submission window. Some journals don't have a cap where as long as you don't have two or more submissions out with them at one time, it's fine as long as it's only one at one time. So if you get rejected, you can submit again, but keeping that in mind. Not submitting previously submitted work or revisions of the same work. I know my personal preference is I don't care if the work, um, as long as it's been significantly revised, I would be happy to read something that has been submitted before, but I think it can depend on the journal. And then not submitting previously published work. And I think that can mostly be an issue if it's been posted on social media. So thinking about Instagram poems and things like that. Something interesting that happened to me in terms of not submitting previously submitted work. There was a poem that I got accepted from a journal, and I was like, "Oh, this is great." But then, as I was looking back in my submission spreadsheet, I realized that I had actually submitted that poem to them before by accident, but I didn't realize that. Um, and I even got like a regular rejection, and then the second time I got an acceptance. So I think it just goes to show that different readers read work differently. Even at the same journal, you might get, a different person who likes your work. I guess I wouldn't recommend doing that, but since it was an accident, it was it was an interesting way to think about um, what can happen in terms of who gets the work. And submitting is also just generally about a numbers game and getting your work across the desk of the right person. Okay. Okay, nice. I'm excited to answer these questions later. All right. So organizing submissions and deadlines, I put together this kind of sample of a submission spreadsheet. I'm also happy to show you my own one later. Um, I think two things that have been really helpful for me in terms of organizing my own submission spreadsheet is using the group function. So you see in the top right-hand corner, the plus and the minus sign. And there's a way that you can collapse a specific group of rows or expand them. And I thought that this function was really helpful in terms of we have a lot of information on the spreadsheet. I think at this time you can see I was submitting a lot of packets, right? I have 4 packets out. I do not have so many packets that I'm submitting right now. But at the time, being able to note where the packets were out at or where I wanted to submit them to, it was really great to have that group function to expand and collapse. I think I've also used the group function in order to note which journals that I want to submit to in the future and what the submission window is. As you can see, the date is listed here. And then reordering my submission spreadsheet. I think I was originally ordering all my submissions in terms of um, chronological order when I was submitting them, but then I decided to organize them by packet. So here you can see that all of the journals color coded in yellow were one packet, and then the green were a different packet, so on and so forth. Okay. All right. I asked some friends how they organize their submission spreadsheets. So similar to what I showed you, Taylor Bias, she said that her favorite aspect of her submission spreadsheet was using color coding, so indicating acceptances, rejections, withdrawals, and submissions that were still in progress. She said that this really helped her be able to notice when she needed to withdraw work from other journals, if she got work accepted into one journal and still had them out at other journals. That was really helpful for her. Gwen Kirby uses tabs. I also started using tabs after I learned this from Gwen Kirby. Having one tab for active submissions. That tab is organized by story. So for poets, organized by packet. There's one tab for rejections. And this tab was organized by journal, and that's what I currently do too. She said this was really helpful, like if she was submitting to one journal for a really long time over the course of a couple of years, she could see like, hey, I still haven't gotten in there yet, or like, hey, I've submitted these poems into this journal. So I should submit other ones if I want to continue submitting there, that sort of thing. And then one tab for acceptances. Sue Cho says she doesn't use a submission spreadsheet. Instead, she uses the Evernote app. So I've never used the Evernote app. Maybe some of y'all have used it. Um, but she liked using it because it was just easy for her to copy and paste if she had an acceptance or rejection to move it to the bottom and to just have it right there on her phone. And then Jose Hernandez Diaz doesn't use a spreadsheet either. Instead, he just tracks his work on Submittable and just keeps that a space that is accessible to him in terms of thinking about where he has submitted or not. And I think another thing that he does is if the journal doesn't use Submittable, to email him himself information about what has been submitted to a different journal. Like I think, for example, Missouri Review uses the other submission manager, so emailing that back to himself. So yeah, lots of different ways. I'm a big fan of the submission spreadsheet, so I'm happy to talk about it a little bit further. If y'all have any other questions about that. All right. Here's a quote from Kim Liao. I think she's a prose writer. Why you should aim for 100 rejections a year. It was published in 2016 by LitHub. So this was a viral essay that was talking about rejections and the experience of rejections, and just a topic that I wanted to make sure to touch on as I've experienced it quite a bit myself. Um, I'll go ahead and read this. My ego resists mustering up the courage to submit writing to literary magazines, pitch articles, and apply for grants, residencies, and fellowships. Yet these painful processes are necessary evils if we are ever to climb out of our safe but hermetic cocoons of isolation and share our writing with the world. Perhaps aiming for rejection, a far more attainable goal, would take some of the sting out of this ego bruising exercise, which so often feels like an exercise in futility. Um, yeah, I thought this was a really wonderful quote that stuck out to me. I think throughout my journey over submitting over the past 10 years, there were definitely ebbs and flows, times where I felt like I was submitting so much, but not getting any acceptances, and that being really discouraging. Like I mentioned earlier, just our field being one where if you want to share your work, you're going to receive a lot of critique and feedback. And the rejections are going to be often really generic, right? Um, so yeah, I think this was really great for me to remember that it can be an ego bruising exercise, but that it's a part of a practice that in a system that we're part of, to think about how we can perspective shift a little bit around that. Um, I've included here a few ways to beat the rejection blues. So trying rejection goals like Kim Liao. I haven't tried that, but I think it would be really cool to see how that would go, or to hear about anybody else's experiences who've tried it. Something that I do is to save and revisit acceptances or encouraging notes. Here you can see one journal that I would love to get into, but I still have not gotten into. And usually, what I do is if I've gotten a nice note from somebody, or even just like somebody emailed me through my website and it was a nice note, I'll just flag it in my inbox. And just being able to have this, like, a little bit of a storage of positive reinforcement for the future has been really helpful for me. Um, Balancing submitting and writing goals. So, hey, I'm getting these rejections, but at the same time, that's not something that I can control. How are how am I thinking about my writing goals and vice versa? Um, Thinking about them separately, two different tasks that we have to do as writers if we want to share our work, but also seeing how they balance each other out and that we can go to one or the other when we're tired of one. And I think the most helpful way to beat rejection blues has been to talk about rejections with friends. Um, yeah, I find that it's often really a bonding experience, especially on social media when you're seeing a lot of success of other people, which is really wonderful. But since it's curated success, that can be really difficult um, as we're going on our own journey in terms of writing and trying to publish our work. Um, I think that sharing with friends also opens up interesting conversation about um, the rejection life of other people. Sometimes you'll find like you've gotten a personal rejection from a journal that your friend who you think is really successful hasn't gotten one at, and that can be kind of a helpful way to remind ourselves that it's a numbers game, and we're all just trying to get lucky at some point, work hard and get lucky at the same time. Um, so that's been really helpful to me too. And I wanted to include, here's one of the personal rejections that I included here, just because it was one of the nicest ones that I've received in terms of being specific about my work. I feel like oftentimes they'll just say like, please send your work again. We'd love to see it again. But then knowing that there are strangers out there who have read my work, that is also really gratifying. I think remembering that I don't always do this, but remembering that like, hey, here's an opportunity from someone I don't know who doesn't have to read my work at all, is able to read my work, and think of it that way, is just a cool experience to think about, especially being in grad school where only my friends and only my classmates who have to um, read my work are reading my work. Um, okay. I'm going to end up here in a moment. I wanted to include this QR code so you can follow this QR code and look for a list of resources that I mentioned. So poets and writers. I included Clifford Garstang, a couple of blog posts like the one about is your poem ready to submit, and the one that I wrote about submission spreadsheets. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. And I would love to talk about your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. At this point, I am going to allow folks to unmute, and I will call people in the order of their stack. It's not too late to stack, so if you've got any questions, please type stack in the chat. If your question has been answered, please hit type cancel. And we will start with Michael. Michael for the first question.
Yeah, just very basic. You know, when you do your research going in, like, okay, is there a guest editor? You know, who is the actual editor? Is there a top editor? And people going through. Does it do you good to name that specific person? You know, dear this person. In that cover letter, or should you just always stick with the dear editor?
I think it doesn't hurt, but I don't think, from my experience, that it does too much. Because oftentimes, when you're saying dear guest editor or dear managing editor, they're not going to be the first ones who are reading your work anyway. So it doesn't have that kind of impact. And when it does get up to them, I think it's sometimes nice to see the name, but really it's just more about the work itself rather
Okay, so
than
basically other people are going to be looking at that first. Okay, that's a great answer.
yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. I'm also gonna, does anybody want to have the QR code up a little bit longer? Gonna stop sharing in a second so I can see more faces.
Great. We're going to go to Maureen for the next question.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I wondered, in terms of a consistent voice, uh, like sometimes my poems are all over the place. So there's not a consistent, like, this is the way Maureen writes, or this is not a consistent voice. Do you think that readers are looking, if you're um, submitting several poems, they're looking for consistency in voice?
That's a great question. Um, I think first and foremost, it's still kind of like, is the work strong? I think that still is kind of the overarching kind of perspective that editors take. But that being said, I think that oftentimes journals will take multiple poems at one time, and I think that they would probably be less likely to take several poems that are widely different in terms of voice, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it would necessarily like harm you in that way, but that in case like they want multiple submissions, or maybe just like the smoothness of the reading experience too, they might have questions going from poem to poem.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Maureen. The next person in the stack is Pablo.
Yeah, I had a question about the Instagram, like published on Instagram. More, can you speak a little bit about that? Especially since like I do
Yeah.
open mics and I like perform certain
Oh,
poems.
sure,
I'm kind of
sure.
starting off at this, so I'm not sure like
Yeah.
what you're talking about when you were talking about that. Thank you.
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, I just want to clarify. So, when you say open mics, are you usually posting like video clips?
Right, because our organization, we run a nonprofit and we
Yeah,
host
yeah.
like we put the all the open mic up. So I don't know if that's something that we should be doing as well. Like we're hurting chances
Sure.
people to submit poetry later on to these magazines. That's kind of what I wanted you to touch on.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so I think definitely when I was talking about Instagram earlier, I was thinking of like written posts, like people post like a picture of like a text box. I think generally videos are treated differently. Maybe Helene has some insight on this too. I think it probably can depend on the journal, but I think that videos are treated differently than text. Do you have any thoughts, Helene?
Yes, I think so when poems are published with like full text or excerpted text, that counts as a publication. So things like Instagram, things like if you are self-publishing a chapbook or self-publishing a book of your own. But things like open mics and performances don't really count towards the same kind of copyright.
Great, thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks for your question. Next person in the stack is Carol. Carol, if you're still with us and have a question, I welcome you to unmute and ask your question to Lisa.
I think her question is in there. How do we know the rejection letters are not AI generated? Why do the editors not sign their names?
Oh, I see that in the chat. Yeah. I wonder if Carol left because her name is grayed out. Should I go ahead and answer? Okay. Um, uh, I think why do editors not sign their names? I think for a variety of reasons. I think some um form emails do have editors' names, but some don't. That being probably because there's a rotating roster of editors. Um, how do we know the rejection letters are not AI generated? I guess we don't know, because they're often, especially the typical rejections are quite generic. But I think just having our trust in the journal itself, if you find it to be a reputable journal, then I would say it's likely that it's a form email that's coming from someone who read your work.
Thank you, Lisa. The next person in the chat is Ayohita.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, my question was, should we treat or consider submissions any differently for visual poetry or poetry that incorporates image, or is this kind of more dependent on finding the right publications for this kind of work?
Yeah, I think there are definitely journals that say they're looking for a wide variety of work. I think those journals might be especially excited to see work that's visual or hybrid in terms of image. Um, but I think you can totally, as long as the journal doesn't say not to, I think you could totally send a visual poem. I've definitely seen them when I was reading for Cincinnati Review, and that being an exciting thing. We got erasures, we got kind of found poems, and I think what is maybe a little bit of a different consideration is the journal's capacity to publish such things. I think some journals that are more print-based might have more difficulty in publishing them. So I know when I was at Cincinnati Review, if an especially interesting visual poem or visual piece that came up, um, we looked at it, but often we were not able to publish it in print. I can think of an erasure that we published online for that reason. Um, yeah, I think there are definitely some journals that are, especially digital journals, that are a little bit more explicit in looking for visual poetry. Those are great to look at too. But I wouldn't say to count some of the other more broader journals out at the same time.
Thanks, Lisa. The next person in the stack is Connie.
Yes, I'm curious how you keep track of your poems, your whole list of poems. How do you find one when you need to find it, but you don't remember the file name?
Oh, okay. So you're not talking about like organizing the submission, but more of organizing the actual poems.
Right, so that you can find what you want for a submission. How do you keep track of all of them?
That's a great question. And also nice because that means you're writing a lot, right? Um, I think um, how I personally do it is poem by name, but then I'll usually group them into files by season. Like maybe I'll do like 2023 or like fall 2024, depending on if I wrote a lot in 2024. If I haven't, maybe it's like a whole year of poems. That's how I generally do it. I would imagine there are different ways that people might do it. I could see people like um, dropping them into files by themes too. I think that might work. But chronological in terms of file folders has been helpful for me. Um, and also, I just think that our computers with our more advanced searching skills has been really helpful. So even if the title, I can't remember it, having the phrase will often populate that into my search bar. Um, but yeah, I'd be curious to know what other people have done, but I've done it sort of grouping them by seasons.
Thanks, Lisa. The next person in the stack is Nina.
Hello?
Hi.
Hi. Okay, so you can hear me. I have a couple of questions. Do you normally get feedback or only in certain types of submissions? And if you do, how have you ever had feedback or ever had a submission and where they like your poem and they want to work with you in strengthening the poem? And if so, how can you find those types of places to submit?
Yeah, great question. So I think what's generally the practice is not giving feedback. Yeah, at all, right? So even if you get to the very last round and your work almost gets into the journal, but maybe the final person who has the last say is not quite sold on it, they'll often just say like, "Hey, this is not quite right for our journal." Um, and yeah, I think even in the nice rejection that I had received, that was pretty kind of more specific and detailed. It talked more about the positive things and not why they decided not to include my work. I think that there are, I can think of one journal off the top of my head. I think it's called Seventh Wave. I'll have to look it up now. But they do more of a model that you're talking about, whether they accept work that they want to work with, rather than wanting to find something that's already a polished piece that they already really love. Um, Seventh Wave. Yeah, and I'll pop this into the chat. Um, but if I'm thinking of the right magazine, what they want to do is kind of build a community of people who work with a work rather than just having the relationship of like, hey, this is already really good.
Mhm. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. Can I ask one more question?
yeah.
Um, in general, what do you think has been most helpful, or what have you learned from the feedback that you received that resulted in you being more successful in getting poems published?
Hmm. You mean just feedback in general
Yeah,
from friends or
I'm very
colleagues?
right. I'm very new at submitting, so I'm not sure what
Yeah.
feedback I will be getting. I mean,
Yeah,
does
yeah,
it
yeah.
does it help over a 10-year period? You've been doing this for 10 years. Is that
Yeah.
feedback helpful?
Um, yeah, I would say definitely from friends and colleagues who, especially friends whose work, whose feedback that I've trusted for a while has been helpful in terms of um, kind of taking an outside look at my work. Like, um, will somebody get what I'm trying to do who doesn't know me is also a question that I think of. Um, Even though, I have friends who give me feedback, they obviously know me better than the average person who's just reading through a submission queue. So I think having that question in mind is like, hey, what would a complete stranger kind of take away from this poem? I think that's been helpful for me. Um, and I think a lesson that I've kind of learned over submitting all of these years is that yeah, people have different tastes, right? If you feel strongly about a specific poem, I would say just keep submitting it out, as long as you, feel okay with the submission fees, because there are poems that I have submitted many, many, many journals. But I felt good about it and eventually it landed somewhere. Whereas, and it's not necessarily the poems you expect. Some poems, it was like picked up right away, and I didn't expect that at all. So I
Mhm.
think each poem itself kind of has its own journey as well, in terms of where does it get placed and how often will it get read before somebody might like it. Does that answer your question?
It's really good. That's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah.
Great. With that, we are at the end of our stack. If anyone else would like to ask a question, I encourage you to, oh, we've got Lynette. Lynette, you're up.
Hi. So I just wondered, the letter you showed us earlier from, maybe it was the Missouri Review, they listed many, many poems. How many poems do you usually put in a packet? And I know some journals have different, like you can submit up to. So do you always submit up to the max? And how many in general?
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think, yeah,
This has been
yeah.
great.
Oh, great. Yeah, Missouri Review, I think, really accepts a lot of poems and is unique in that way. I can't remember off the top of my head, is it like 8 to 12 or like 10 to 15, like a lot of poems, which is why the list was so long. And I would say, like, if you have that many poems, submit up to the max. But yeah, generally it's around 5 to 6 pages or 5 to 6 poems. Just because if you're paying like a submission fee, you might as well have them read all the work that you can get them to read at one time. I know for Missouri Review in particular, I was like, oh, when am I ever going to get up to like 8 pages again so I can submit again to them? Because I felt like I always ran out quickly. But yeah, I would say max it out if you can. But I've also submitted like 4 poems or like 5 poems. I try not to submit 3 poems because I just want to be able to put it out there all at once since depending on their journal, but it can take months to hear back for that reason.
Great, thank you. The next in the stack is Pamela and John.
Oh, actually, hi, it's just Pamela, but thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate all this information. You spoke earlier about revising poems, and if you could speak a little bit more about
I'm not play anymore, you guys.
and whoops and when how much revision a poem would take before it would be appropriate to submit it for publication if it's already been published once. Thank you.
Oh, sorry,
Stop.
can you?
They don't want to play. Oh my gosh,
Someone's-
I'm so sorry. I was talking
You're
to my
fine.
dog.
Yeah, someone's pet. um, Sorry, Pamela, can you clarify like the last part when you said if it's already been published once or
Yeah,
something?
so it was actually the first poem I ever wrote was published just locally here in a newspaper. And you go back and read it and think, oh, maybe I could improve on that or maybe expand on that. So kind of when do you cross that line of kind of having a new poem, I guess, that could be submitted someplace else?
Oh, I see. So the idea that you want to, you really like that idea of the original poem, but not necessarily the form it's in. So wanting to be able to resubmit it again if you
Or
revise it a bunch.
yes, yes. So how does that protocol work?
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that reminds me of my first year in my MFA where I showed this poem to my faculty poet, and he was like, it's fine. But then I wrote another poem, what I thought was a different poem, and he was like, oh, this is a good revision of the original poem. And I was like, I didn't think that was a revision, but it's interesting to think of it that way. Um, so that being said, I think that you know, like all across our writing life, we might write poems that are about similar topics, but that you might approach them differently. So keeping that in mind, I think that um, it should be different enough that maybe even if the topic is similar, that you're approaching it in a little bit different, in a little bit of a different way, whether it's like the form, the language, perspective. Um, the images used. I wouldn't say that there's like a hard and fast line of how different something needs to be, but I think that if they're, put next to each other, are they more like, are they different enough in that they're kind of speaking to similar things, but that they are engaging with it in a different way? I think that would be something that you wouldn't have to worry about if you wanted to resubmit it somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. This has been really wonderful. Thank you everyone for being here and for all of your wonderful questions. I think your questions have made this the session really rich and informative. Just as a plug, this has been brought to you by the Chicago Poetry Center. If you'd like to learn more about our work, please visit us at poetrycenter.org. Please look out for our next 2 learning series sessions. The first will happen in a couple of months, and we will learn about how to apply for writing residencies. And then in spring, we will learn about how to organize a poetry manuscript. So thank you for being here. Thank you again, Lisa, and everyone have a wonderful night.